Chapter 9 focuses on the role of political parties in the American political system. First, what are political parties? Well, to start with, during the debates over ratification of the Constitution, James Madison refers to groups with certain opinions, strong opinions, as factions. Today you have political parties, you also have interest groups that could be considered factions, but political parties are very organized groups that attempt to influence the government by electing their members to important government offices. And James Madison tried to reassure people, particularly in Federalist number 10, that factions were in fact a good thing. If you had competing groups, then no one group would ever be able to gain too much control in the government. So in theory, our two-party system could be a force for good to maintain balance. So a two-party system is a system in which only two parties have a realistic opportunity to compete effectively for control. Do we have third, fourth, fifth parties? Yes. But the Republican Party and the Democratic Party are really the only two with realistic chances of electing someone. The very first ever two-party system was the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. The Federalists supported a strong federal government. They supported, in particular, Alexander Hamilton's financial plan when he was Secretary of the Treasury under George Washington. And the Democratic Republicans opposed a strong federal government and preferred that more decision-making and power as far as like what's going to affect the everyday life of a citizen, that should be left much more up to the states. And that movement is led by Thomas Jefferson, who was actually Secretary of State under George Washington. So as you can imagine, cabinet meetings were probably pretty spirited between these two. Here's a slide outlining some of the major views of both sides. And Hamilton, like I was saying before, believed in concentrating power in the federal government, whereas Jefferson believed much more in state and local governments having more power. Hamilton feared mob rule, whereas Jefferson and his followers feared the absolute power of a single ruler. And Hamilton viewed things under the Constitution as a republic that would be led by a well-educated elite, whereas Jefferson thought much more in terms of democracy and even people like farmers and tradespeople having a role within that democratic system. Hamilton believed in a loose interpretation of the Constitution versus Jefferson believing in a strict interpretation. We've learned these terms before. Hamilton promoted his idea of a national bank as part of his financial plan, and Jefferson believed the national bank to be unconstitutional based on his strict interpretation of the Constitution. Hamilton saw an economy based on shipping and manufacturing, whereas Jefferson saw an economy centered around agriculture. Hamilton believed in establishing a national debt that encompassed all national and state debts at the signing of the Constitution, whereas Jefferson thought that only the national debt should be paid for, particularly because he was from Virginia, which had already paid off much of its war debt from the American Revolution, and he thought it irresponsible for Virginia to then be saddled with the debts of other states when everything was combined into one big national debt. So, therefore, who supported Hamilton? Merchants, manufacturers, landowners, investors, lawyers, the clergy. A lot of people in positions of power, versus who supported Jefferson? A lot more of the plain people, like farmers and tradespeople. So, very contrasting views. The second two-party system. This is when the Democrats and Whigs, primarily, were the opposition parties. Democrats opposed the national bank. They promoted Western expansion, whether it was through war or purchase, and were absolutely fervent defenders of slavery, above and beyond almost anything else. Their most famous member, especially early in the party's history, is Andrew Jackson. Whigs, however, promoted a market economy. They wanted a strong, growing economy. They supported continuing Hamilton's financial plan, particularly the National Bank. They opposed the Mexican War, and they really refused to take a firm stance on slavery one way or the other. So really, this is the party of economic growth at the time. Again, you can see here a big long list. I won't go through it in quite as much detail, but you see the Whigs, who were strong opponents of Andrew Jackson, the Democrats, who obviously supported him. He was a member of their party. And the Whigs and Democrats were just as divided, if not more so, than the Federalists and Democratic Republicans. You could see this laundry list of differences between them. You could pause the video here and read through them if you wanted to. I'm not going to go into that much detail about the Whigs and the Democrats. Then you have the Civil War and Reconstruction system, where, as I mentioned before, Democrats are pro-slavery, and then after the winning of the Civil War by the Union, they are anti-civil rights. They are the party of Jim Crow. Republicans, on the other hand, in this time period, are anti-slavery. Even those who were not strong abolitionists at least spoke out against the system for the abomination that it was. And then after the war, they were pro-civil rights. You could see here the Democratic Party advertising in the Reconstruction period, the two platforms. The Democratic platform is for the white man, and the Republican platform is for the Negro. This is a very common view in the Civil War and Reconstruction period. Then you have the system of 1896. The Democrats, who kind of encompassed the populist movement, are very anti-business and industry and are very much more pro-labor. So they're worried much more about the little guy against the powerful big guy. Whereas Republicans are pro-business and industry. They think that the economic growth of the industrial period is going to benefit everybody, regardless of social class. And they are anti-labor because they view labor as cutting into the profits of their pro-business attitudes and will only do harm if they lead to an economic downturn. Next, you have the New Deal system, which the Democrats believed that the government needed to take an active role in regulating business and the economy, particularly to help combat poverty. Whereas Republicans still believed very much in laissez-faire. The government has no place in the regulation of business or the economy, and poverty is best combated by private charities. Like I said, they are still believers in laissez-faire economics. And this is the New Deal system, something you're probably a lot more familiar with, having learned it so many times. And then you have the contemporary party system. Make no mistake, modern politics is very much a boxing match. Democrats promote various social policies paid for by increased taxation, and they really prefer an isolationist foreign policy, minding your business and staying out of foreign affairs. Republicans, on the other hand, promote tax cuts to spur economic growth. They don't want high taxes. They don't think it's the government's responsibility to pay for social policies. And they prefer a much more aggressive foreign policy, addressing issues such as human rights violations across the world, or throughout the early 2000s, the War on Terror. Electoral realignment happens when a new party supplants the ruling party. And that shows in these maps off to the right of these are all presidential elections, what party is predominantly in power in particular times. And realignment is when it goes from one party being in control to another. So from 1976 to 1980, one presidential election apart, you can see a big shift from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. Likewise, in only 4 years, one election's difference, you can see from 2004 to 2008 a shift from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. So this is textbook electoral realignment. You can see long-term trends here, and you could compare any number of elections to each other. Some of the strongest Democratic times would have been in the 1960s. Here you can see Lyndon Johnson winning in 1964. Probably one of the strongest times for Republicans was the 1980s. You could see Ronald Reagan's initial election here and a re-election here. But you can also see major shifts from 1984 and then again in 1988, strong Republican performances, and then boom, here come the Democrats in 1992. You can see Republicans having won in 2000 and 2004, and then boom, Democrats come in 2008 to take things over. Divided government means that the American government is partly controlled by one party and partly controlled by another. Now, unified government under a particular person's leadership, you can see throughout the Great Depression that FDR had full control of the government, with his party also controlling Congress. You can see, however, though, there was a window of time where his successor, Harry Truman, was dealing with a Republican-controlled Congress. You can see his successor, Eisenhower, having a very brief time where he and his party, the Republicans, had full control of government, but then had to deal with a Democratic Congress. The short window of time that President Kennedy was president, he had full control of the government. Lyndon Johnson had full control of the government. Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford spent their entire presidencies working with a Democratic Congress. Jimmy Carter had full control of the government. Ronald Reagan dealt throughout his presidency with a divided Congress. George H.W. Bush dealt with a fully Democratic Congress. Bill Clinton dealt with a divided government, but only after a couple of years of full control. And George W. Bush began and ended his presidency dealing with a divided government or a government completely controlled by the opposition, but for a window of time did enjoy full control of the government. So, divided government, these times when you might have one party controlling the executive branch, the presidency, and another party controlling the legislative branch, or Congress. A few different times when cooperation existed between the two major parties. In the 1950s, when Dwight Eisenhower was president. In the 1980s, when Presidents Reagan and Bush were in office, and again in the 1990s when President Clinton was in office. After the controversial election of 2000, you saw a lot of cooperation go out the window. But in the 50s, Republican President Eisenhower dealt with a Democratic Congress throughout much of his presidency. In the 80s, Ronald Reagan never once enjoyed full control of government. He was always dealing with either divided government or a fully controlled Democratic Congress. George H.W. Bush was dealing with a full Democratic Congress the whole time he was president. Bill Clinton, although he enjoyed a brief moment of full control of government, he had to work with the Republican Party throughout the 1990s. Eisenhower was working closely with Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson, who later became president. Ronald Reagan was working with Speaker of the House Tip O'Neill. And in the 90s, President Clinton was working with Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich. So those were like cooperative, collaborative relationships that really, unfortunately, just don't exist anymore in politics. The two-party system makes the two parties dominant, but you do have third parties. You have the Green Party, primarily focused with environmental issues. You have the Socialist Party that believes in socialism, in high taxes and redistribution of wealth. You have the Constitution Party that believes in going back to a more originalist view of the Constitution. You have the Libertarian Party that is a weird mixture of social views that are traditionally democratic and liberal, but then fiscal monetary views that are traditionally very conservative and more Republican. A party platform is a document written at the National Convention that contains the party's philosophy, its positions on issues, and where it sees the country going. And it's a good way of informing the public, hey, this is what we believe, come vote for us. You can see images here of both the 2012 Democratic and Republican national conventions. Political machines. These are strong party organizations. They were famous in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Not that machines don't still exist, but they have to be a whole lot better at hiding it. Back in the late 19th century and early 20th century, it was a lot easier to just be openly corrupt, and it was just not covered in the newspapers, and therefore not a lot of people knew a whole lot about it. And anyway, probably one of the most famous political machines is Boss Tweed, depicted here in a political cartoon and a portrait of him here. And a machine really, their primary goal is to make a lot of money off of government contracts. So if you remember watching Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, that political machine led by Jim Taylor and supported by Senator Payne in the Senate was getting all of these Depression-era dam projects and making filthy amounts of money off of it. And that was usually the goal of political machines, is to funnel money into their business operations. Lastly, how do you manage a machine? Or even if you don't have a full machine going, how do you get what you need and want from government? Patronage. Patronage is the resources available to higher officials. Usually it's opportunities to make partisan appointments to offices, to offer grants, licenses, or special favors to supporters. So for example, if someone donates a crap ton of money to your campaign, you get elected president, you appoint them to your presidential cabinet. That is classic patronage. That's the end of the presentation. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Otherwise, I'll see you in class.